And they didn't vote for the tax plan. Today marks 6 months since the tax reform was enacted into law. Your reflections half a year out, Congressman, tell us what you would have liked to do that didn't get done here that perhaps you'd like to work on for the next leg of this. How do you see it?
Well, number one, you can't find any. It's hard to find any bad news in the tax plan. You know, 1 million new jobs, tied for the lowest unemployment in 50 years. Incomes on the rise, more so than any time in the last decade. Small business optimism off the chart. There is no greater economic stimulus than business optimism. Things I'd like to work. Well, number one, this is historic. I mean, this is once in a generation tax reform. Things that I would still like to work on is capital gains tax relief. I'd like, one of the things we didn't quite nail down was simplicity, which was one of our goals. So there's more to do. I would hope we could get a little bit of bipartisan buy-in here. I don't know if we can, but again, my hat's off to the president, the speaker, Chairman Brady on the House side. They did a fantastic job, and it's the difference between the Obama 1.7% economy and the Trump. We're averaging 3% economy, and the consensus is, for the second quarter of 2018, we're probably going to be at 4% economic growth. And so if you look at the history of America, almost all of our job creation, almost all of our income rises, almost all of our poverty reduction happens in 3% plus growth years.
Wow.
That's happening under this Republican administration, this Republican Congress.
Well, you're going to need that for the deficits that we're facing, aren't you?
Well, that's for sure. But let's also remember, if you believe that tax cuts are supposed to pay for themselves, as long as the economy is averaging over 2.8%, it's paying for itself. Increased revenue is part of the deficit solution. Ultimately, we have to reform current entitlement programs for future generations. Again, something that takes bipartisan buy-in, and so far, again, all we've received is the Heisman from Democrats.
Right. You're working on a bipartisan capital formation package as well, right? The Senate has agreed to take that up?
They have agreed to take that up, and this is wonderful news because, unfortunately, as recently as 2016, entrepreneurship was at a 40-year low, which means still in America you got too many garages with old cars and not enough with new startups. What we've also seen is that IPOs are in a 20-year slide, and that we have half the IPOs that we had 20 years ago. We're not going to compete with China unless we turn that around. We're not going to have long-term 3% plus growth until we turn that around. And Maria, one of the good news items is that at least historically, capital formation has been a bipartisan issue. In fact, the first so-called Jobs Act, Jumpstart Our Business Startups, was actually signed into law by President Obama. So I'm telling Democrats, he's kind of giving you license to work on this. This is about Main Street investors having more investment opportunities. It's about competing with China. It's about long-term economic growth. It's about getting capital to small business and startups.
Yeah.
It's something that the whole family can join in on. So,
Congressman, you mentioned China. Let me ask you, I know that the Treasury right now is working on releasing those investment restrictions and the details there to China, along with the tariffs that the president has put into place. What kind of restrictions are we talking about? I mean, would you go as far as limiting the number of IPOs that the Chinese can take public on the New York Stock Exchange?
Well, I haven't studied that specific issue, but we are doing reform of what is known as CFIUS, that has to do with direct foreign investment into the U.S. And particularly, I mean, let's face it, China's the big offender by hook and crook, taking our intellectual property, our high technology. I mean, it's part and parcel of their Made in China 2025 plan. And so it's something that has to be confronted, and particularly for national defense. We've got to be careful about this technology and intellectual property going to China. And again, they're doing it by hook and crook and in violating all the rules of the WTO. That's where the real problem is. So I haven't looked at the IPO problem per se, but let's face it. I mean, so many of their companies ultimately are state-owned companies.
Right.
They are state actors. And so we can't be naive about this, and we do have to improve our laws. So the Senate has passed a version to update this.
Right.
And the House, I think we're going to be taking this up next week on the House floor, and we'll go to conference, get a bill on the president's desk soon.
Congressman, good to see you, sir. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Jeb Hensarling joining us this morning.